Excellent. So welcome, James Chappell.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us on your Sunday lunchtime. Would you mind introducing yourself to the people listening?
Yeah, sure. So I'm James Chappell. I'm kind of interested in digital footprints and what digital footprints mean for the security of businesses. I've been doing that now for the last 8 years. I've been in InfoSec, I guess, for about 15 or 16. Started off in telecoms, then spent about 10 years in consulting prior to starting this footprints journey in 2011.
So I think Mark's gone on mute. I'll take over. So 2019, was a good year for you? Anything to reflect back on?
It's been a fascinating year from my perspective. I guess we've seen a whole bunch of different things change. So I was always sort of chatting a little bit about some of the sort of vulnerabilities. We've had some interesting ones. I thought the 2019-07-08 vulnerability was an interesting one to track. I look at sort of threats from publicly available information. It was interesting to see how that unfolded and how that was discussed. I think sort of the way that data loss has continued to accelerate has been super interesting. I think looking at just sort of the digitization of crime, I think is sort of quite another interesting sort of, it's really become quite industrialized in a way that hasn't been for a very long time either. So it's been, I think 2019 is super interesting. I think those are things though, I think that will continue to accelerate throughout next year as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. We've got Zach in, who you are joining in your slot, or is joining you. Zach, would you unmute your microphone for us?
There you go, unmuted. Hey guys.
How you doing, Zach?
Zach.
Good. Okay, just for the benefit of people that are not familiar with you, could you just tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so a couple of hats. I used to work for the same company as James, actually, which is a weird coincidence. So
we planned it.
Well done for planning that. So we overlapped to a company called Detica, which was a cybersecurity business, which is now part of BAE. So that kind of explains where I got the cyber bug from.
Yeah.
I guess two hats. I run a surveillance business right now, which focuses on video surveillance and facial recognition and exciting stuff like that, working for various government agencies around the world. And then I also write opinionated kind of monologues around cybersecurity when things take my interest or I feel are worthy of a bit of a rant. So that's where I guess most people will probably be familiar with me.
Fantastic.
The one thing I wanted to ask both you guys, do you guys see the threat landscape changing, like the threat actors? Do you see the different trends?
I'm happy to have a quick crack at that. Definitely. So I think one of the couple of interesting things, sort of the level of industrialization that we see in things like fraud has changed enormously. So if you look at something simple like business email compromise fraud, there's now toolkits, and the scale of those crimes has risen hugely. I think also it's gone from sort of like high volume, low value to low volume, high value as well. That's sort of another shift I think we've seen a lot. So a lot more targeted, a lot less sort of generic types of crime that we see online.
I would agree with that. I mean, the fact that you can customize by region, by language, your phishing emails from kits that are available online, truly industrial levels. I completely agree with that. Zach, are you seeing sort of advanced persistent threat actor techniques bleed over into the more common criminal activities, or is there still sort of a differentiation between the low skilled actor and the APT actor?
I think at a basic level, there's clearly a difference. So the level of sophistication across the state-sponsored guys is different. And I think in both spheres, it's been a really interesting year. And I think we'll look back on this year as being quite seminal. I think on the generic cybercrime side, the attacks on, mainstream platforms, clearly Android and iOS, I think we've seen more of that this year than ever before. And probably users have lost their innocence a bit this year. I think if you've got an Android device and haven't yet clocked the issue, then you've clearly not been on the internet for the last 12 months. And Apple, which has always played the secure ring-fenced card, has, had a couple of punches to the nose this year and is now in recovery mode. I think on the kind of the nation state side, it's actually even more interesting, although clearly less publicized. I think we've seen, I've kind of talked before about the coming together of the cyber domain and the physical domain, and we've seen kind of an action in one sphere being kind of, we've seen retaliation in the other. And if you go talk to senior military leaders, they'll talk about hybrid warfare and the role of the media. They've got cybersecurity divisions they're standing up. They're looking at social media. We have not seen that before. And I think, again, we'll look back at this year as the year that kind of the high-end national security military sphere kind of changed for good.
James, how do you see the cyber criminal adapting? Is it going to be a case of, if you're not using the latest tools, if you're not emulating or learning from APTs, you'll be out of the game because our defenses are going to be sort of set at that low level bar? Or what do you think?
Actually, it's quite interesting. I was chatting to a couple of people this week about just Cryptolock ransomware, where the actor had gone in and used remote access toolkits to case the joint to work out who they should target, which team they should target first before they go in. We're also seeing that with things like invoice fraud as well. We're seeing sort of, again, remote access toolkits, again, probably a bit more commodity. So they're using sort of known vulnerabilities, but as we know, most organizations have some of those vulnerabilities in them. And then, you might not see O-days quite as regularly with the criminal audience, but they're certainly, they're not doing simple stuff. They're doing sort of fairly advanced, sort of getting in, spending time casing the joint, because the payoff now is so much bigger than it used to be. We're not talking about a few $100s. We're talking about, hundreds of thousands of pounds. Especially look at things like the construction industry. If I'm getting between the invoice, the payment for a big concrete pour in a building, for example, that's hundreds of thousands of pounds in one hit. So they'll spend time on it and they'll properly case the joint.
So are you suggesting that the delays in Crossrail may be cyber attack related?
I'm sure if they could rely on that excuse, they would, right?
The spin. Zach, that brings me to, a really interesting sort of point. Like, as a journalist, at some point you have to assert a theory. And it seems to me that a lot of the time it's ephemeral, that it's a very much a changing situation on the ground. How do you sort of approach that from a journalistic perspective? Because as you probably are aware, there are many people out on Twitter that are all too quick to criticize journalism in InfoSec.
I think that's right. And I think, and again, there's different levels. I mean, we're peeling an onion here, right? And the really interesting thing about trying to cover the threat actors, the nation state guys, is there's, attribution is always assumed, or you're kind of trying to join the dots. You don't know. And I think what we've seen in the last few months is some really interesting research around trying to join the dots up. And we've seen real differences between what's happening, say, Russia and China. You've seen, North Korea and Iran really trying to step up to the table. Just in the last couple of days, you've seen, further stuff coming out of Vietnam. And I think what that is doing is putting into the public domain, or the shadowy public domain, some serious cyber tools that are then being picked up by the cyber criminals. So you go onto the dark web right now, and there are state-sponsored toolkits that are available that are being sold. And I think what we've seen as well is the commercial entrepreneurship, if you like, of some of the nation state guys. I mean, these are arm's length guys, right? So they're not carrying government creds. So they're clearly moonlighting overnight and making a few quid for themselves. And that is putting some serious tools into the public domain. You asked the question before in terms of levels of sophistication and what's changed. As a user, we all see the email compromise stuff that comes into every business, and it's easy to spot. A lot of this stuff is not easy to spot anymore. And you kind of look at it and you think, well, yeah, that's seriously clever. They've used you, they've assumed what you're interested in, they've picked up some of your interests, and you really have to have your wits about you, and that's new. And it's really quite hard to work out as someone who runs an organization how you train people to spot that stuff.
Can I ask you a question, guys? What are your thoughts on the things that we've seen an increase in the last 12 months around nations falling out with nations at a tech level? So the example I'm going to cite is Huawei. Okay. So America and Canada, for that matter, got a little bit pissed off with Huawei for various different reasons. Some of that bled into the UK. The NCSC had a view on it. long story short, we ended up with Google or America embargoing US companies from dealing with Huawei, which led to Google stopping support for their Android OS, and ultimately led to Huawei having to fast track its development of its own OS. Now, it seemed to me at the time, I work in telecommunications, so we are familiar with Huawei as a provider. It seemed very tit for tat and very trade led rather than security led. So, what are your thoughts on that, chaps?
I happy to give this one. So it's quite interesting seeing how politics now seems to play a role in people's assessment of risk. I think supply chain risk has always existed. So even if you think back to things like Lenovo laptops, do you remember, when the manufacturing location for those laptops changed, there was sort of a bit of an outcry at that point. We've seen it with antivirus, with Kaspersky. We've seen it with, now Huawei is the latest one on the list. But I think what's really important is you've got to know the risks you're protecting against, understand where you might be vulnerable, and then apply the right sort of approach. So I think that's sort of largely the sort of approach the NTSC suggested. And I think that's sort of quite well aligned advice. I kind of think it sucks a bit that politics gets involved in some of these discussions, because from an information security practitioner's point of view, I think you should just care about the risk and manage it. And I realise that I live in a global world, but I also think, let's just have a sensible conversation about what the risks are and figure out the right application.
Huawei, how long have we got, right? Where do we start? I think it's interesting, right? And it's not a new issue. The Huawei issue has been 10 years in the making. And what's happened is the West, writ large, has got itself into a position where it's committed and it's put in 3G, 4G kit. And then, at the end of that, the security guys have said there might be an issue here. And actually everyone's completely bedded down within it and it's caused chaos. So, if you look at the accusations that are being leveled by Washington around state control, financial support, the theoretic risk of some kind of national security issue, and that could be data in kind of inception, or it could just be switching stuff off, right?
Yeah.
None of it's proven. There is no smoking gun. And that's clearly Huawei's primary defense. But from a West perspective, if Huawei was Russian or North Korean or Iranian, we wouldn't be having this debate. It'd have been stripped out, right?
Sure.
And we're kind of in a weird grey area with Chinese tech because everything's made in China. So there's a big Chinese organization makes kit. We're fine with it. The issue is much broader, and I actually think the irony is that the real issue that we're facing right now is an IoT issue. It's not a 5G issue. And I think we're starting to see more discussion around the vulnerabilities of putting all of these connected endpoints into our homes and offices. It's not the network, it's the actual devices. And, I suspect if you want a trend for 2020, it's going to be serious scare stories about IoT vulnerabilities.
Okay.
The other thing is we see a trend where politicians are getting involved, and often they might not have all the knowledge at hand. Do you guys agree? I like one good example is Hawaii. The other is backdoor for encryption.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, what are you guys' thoughts on politicians starting to get involved in these types of things?
I think they need to be advised well by the sort of technical experts around them. I think I think there's a legitimate discussion, because I think sort of UK Gov suggested the sort of ghost user approach, which I think is the one that has been posited in the Home Office debate at the moment in the UK about monitoring social media. It is monitoring messaging applications. I should be accurate about that. It is interesting. So clearly, we do have domestic extremism, we do have terrorist events here in the UK. There is a dialogue about how do you get better at detecting those. But it's got to be. I mean, you are going to force it to another channel if you sort of say, well, these channels are the ones that are monitored, but what about these ones over here that sit outside our jurisdiction, aren't people we can monitor? You're just going to shift all that traffic elsewhere. And actually, it's not the encryption that gets exploited. It's not the encryption that stops it sometimes. If someone really wants to get into that, and they're going to use other techniques to get into that conversation. So, yeah, it's a tricky one. Definitely worthy of some debate, I think.
Yeah.
And it's not new. I mean, lawful intercept's been around forever, and kind of what we did as business that James and I overlapped. What you're seeing now is the fact that the lawful intercept guys are locked out, and the challenge is that if they find a way in, then that backdoor is potentially available to people that you wouldn't want to give it to, and that ultimately is the best defense that the messaging guys have. Is if they create, any backdoor is a vulnerability, and it doesn't. The Ghost Protocol idea that came out of the UK, if you put that in, then somebody's going to pick that up in Russia or China or Iran. Of course they are. So say again, sorry.
I was just going to say, like, I get it. I get, with a lawful order and a court process, the company should be compelled. Some companies have architected their solution so that that's nearly impossible. But, recently revealed to the world was that Telegram had built in some capability, some intercept capability, and shut down a pretty massive group of jihadist ISIS members. So, I keep seeing this, we need encryption backdoor, but then I'm like, but law enforcement still seems to be doing great things and taking down, child exploitation rings and counterfeit property and massive money laundering. There is now a Lamborghini with a pretty cool paint job for sale as a result of U.S. indictments. So I almost think that, this is a smoke and mirrors game, and this is not, a real debate. What are your thoughts, guys?
I think there's definitely success in monitoring some of the things that people need to monitor with lawful intercepts. There's no doubt about that, and has made a big impact. I struggle to see the benefit of getting into those channels because you're just going to push that conversation somewhere else. It's quite interesting if you think about services like Telegram. I think it's the Russian regulator gets involved in some of that. So you've got other pressure from other countries getting involved in that. Now you're into the intel sharing discussion about who shares intel with who. So yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of a bit of a privacy nut. So I don't like the idea of breaking mathematics, which is essentially what it is. Yeah, but I can see the arguments on the other side as well. So I think it's good to debate.
And I think it's, on balance, it's got to be privacy, because the risks of not privacy are simply too great. And what's been really interesting this year is we've seen endpoint vulnerability. Candidly, if you want to hack what's going on in WhatsApp, you hack the iPhone or you hack the Android device, you don't hack WhatsApp. That's clearly what's happened. If an agency wants to get in the middle of a conversation, they've just got to hack one end of that conversation. And we know that. And that is a sophisticated thing to do, but then it protects, the mass of people in terms of the security of their own communications.
Because the other thing that I think people don't realize is if you start playing around with these things, the attackers are just going to go off and do their own thing. Haven't we already seen that with some of the ISIS where they develop their own platforms?
Yeah, and hopefully they've got plenty of holes in them as well, right? So they can be exploited. But yeah, exactly right.
Cool.
All right, guys. In the last couple of minutes of the session, fascinating stuff. Zach, I guess you gave us a little bit of an insight into your thoughts around the next year and probably forever, really, around IoT risk and all that kind of stuff. But just give us an idea, James, what you think we might be seeing more and more of in the next 12 months and maybe even beyond.
I was very interested in some of the SecDevOps discussions on the show earlier. I'm really interested to see how developing code is changing the way that companies lose data and the way that they're vulnerable. And I think as a theme, it's a really interesting one because the way we're producing code is changing. We can do it quicker, better, faster than ever before, but it's brought a whole host of new risks, which I think are interesting for us as professionals to have to manage. So I think 2020 for me that's going to be a really interesting area.
Yeah.
Open S3 buckets all over the place.
Oh, yes.
Remember, Sean, S3 is not vulnerable when you buy it. It's vulnerable when you configure it.
Yep.
All right. So, okay, gentlemen, that's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you ever so much for taking time to join us.
No problem. Really enjoyed it.
We really appreciate your time. So thank you very much indeed.
Good luck with the rest of the day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.